I fought for God. Who do you fight for, Exile?
Hello and welcome to another Path of Exile guide, this time with a double strike champion. If you're tired of having people tell you melee is dead or that you can only play bugged or broken builds, then this guide should be your perfect comeback. Not only is melee alive and kicking, but it's also punching stuff in their ugly faces. With incredible mobility, great defenses and very solid damage against both single targets and large packs, the build is an awesome all-rounder capable of easily doing pretty much all existing content. More importantly, however, this build simply feels great to play. Action-packed, fast-paced, high-impact combat will always have you come back for more. Frankly, this is how Path of Exile was always meant to be played. My aim was to also make the build accessible to newer players, so it doesn't really need any mandatory unique items apart from a pair of really cheap gloves. It works very well with lower budgets, but there's always room to invest into more expensive gear and get better performance. Really, if you want to, you can drop 50 exalts on this build and you'll still find ways to push it even further. This makes it an excellent league starter which can afterwards transition into a full-blown min-max build to carry you through an entire league. It's not, however, an absolutely perfect build. It cannot run physical reflect maps and no leech or no regen will make you really vulnerable. I would also not recommend it for hardcore play simply because you operate in extreme melee range and every now and then you'll die a stupid death from something you're not able to avoid. Still, one thing you'll hopefully get to appreciate is that your own skill as a player will truly make a difference. First time playing the build, you'll do just fine, but stick with it and you'll see better and better results even without upgrading a single piece of gear. Well, I've sold you the build, now let's see how you actually get to play it and put together all its pieces. As usual, the guide is divided into 7 main sections: build overview, passive tree and leveling, ascendancy, pantheon, gems and links, gear, flasks and jewels, and finally pros and cons. In the video description below you'll find a link for importing the entire build guide in Path of Building tool. It includes the passive tree broken down into level brackets, example gear and a detailed notes section on gearing, stats priorities and gems. With that out of the way, let's start with the build overview. This build relies on a very simple melee skill called Double Strike. The name is simple, the gem description is simple, the playstyle is simple. Really, the only way this could be easier would be to have a skill called Hit or Punch. As the name suggested, Double Strike performs 2 fast attacks and, apart from the visual effect, this actually has a very important gameplay implication. Both those attacks will trigger on-hit effects such as blind on hit or life gain on hit, making these much more valuable for this build. On top of that, Double Strike gains a huge amount of extra physical damage against bleeding targets and has an innate chance to cause bleeding on hit. As such, the build focuses on getting a high chance to bleed to ensure that extra damage bonus is always active. Bleeding itself won't really do much DPS, but apart from boosting Double Strike's damage, it also enables the use of Hemophilia unique gloves. This will cause any bleeding enemies you kill to explode, dealing 5% of their max life as physical damage in an area around them. This is a crucial component for the build as Double Strike is very single target oriented by default. Apart from these explosions, you'll be using Ancestral Call as well, bringing your mass clearing potential to a very decent level. By now you've probably noticed that everything revolves around physical damage, and indeed that's the only type of damage you'll be dealing with this build. Not only does this make it easier to focus your gear, but you'll also be immune to elemental damage reflect. Another advantage of a pure physical damage build is gaining a lot more value from the impale mechanic. When a hit applies impale to a target, 10% of that hit's physical damage is stored on that enemy as a debuff. Subsequent hits against that monster will release that stored damage. It's basically a one-step delayed additional source of damage. Now, it might not seem like much or too strong, but in reality impale is more than half of your entire damage. So whatever you do, don't ignore or replace or downplay this mechanic, it's one of the most important components of the build. Finally, with the build being focused on a single type of damage, more passives and item affixes can be dedicated to crit chance and crit multiplier. But enough about damage, let's talk a bit about defenses as well. Being on the lower part of the passive tree and using champion as your Ascendancy class translates into huge amounts of armor, very high evasion chance, greatly improved fortify buff, a shitload of life leech and life regen, as well as using Warcries for permanent uptime of endurance charges. In the end, it all adds up to a very well-rounded, fast and heavy hitting tank. While that's a lot of info I've just dumped on you, don't worry, we'll unravel it piece by piece in the passives, gems and gearing sections respectively. And speaking of that, let's actually start with the passive tree and leveling. You start off as a duelist and you can immediately start using double strike from the very first town. However, since you cannot yet use Hemophilia gloves for the corpse explosions, temporarily use melee splash support gem. This will make leveling much smoother and you can drop it once you get the gloves. As for the passives, Act 1 is quite packed with excellent picks. Master of the Arena, Art of the Gladiator and Dervish provide a great deal of attack speed and damage, while Bravery will boost your life, evasion and armor. Some movement speed, life regen, melee strike range and dexterity, all these will add up to a very strong start. Act 2 continues in a similar fashion. Gladiator's Perseverance provides great bonuses to life leech and physical damage, while Warrior's Blood and Heart of the Warrior increase your overall HP and life regen. These should definitely help keep you alive, leading to a nice and smooth leveling process. Top this off with Versatility, an excellent DPS passive that also brings some dexterity and intelligence, helping out with gearing and off-color gems. This act also brings with it the Deal with the Bandits quest, and for this build the best option is to help Alira. Pretty much all her bonuses are useful for this build: critical strike multiplier, mana regeneration, as well as a decent amount of elemental resistances. These will make both leveling and endgame gearing much easier. Acts 3 and 4 will shift the focus to damage with Born to Fight, Blade of Cunning and Dismembering. These passives start building your crit stats and they'll only get stronger as you add more of that. Finally, add Soul of Steel, one of the strongest defensive passives on the tree. Huge amounts of armor and physical damage reduction, as well as increased max resistances. In Acts 5 and 6, path through Juggernaut for some additional armor and HP, and then pick up Red Storm and Razor's Edge. These will greatly increase your chance to inflict bleeding, as well as boost your physical damage quite significantly. Going through Acts 7 and 8, Bloodless Will and Barbarism provide a decent amount of life and resistances, while Blade Master and Disemboweling are some of the best DPS passives you can get on this side of the tree. As you approach the end of story mode and Act 10, the game starts throwing more dangerous stuff at you, so it's a good time to boost your defenses. First, drop a whole bunch of points into the so-called Life Wheel around Constitution, which will greatly increase your life pool. After that, grab 3 regular jewel sockets. These can be really useful to help cap your resistances, boost your life as well as damage. They offer great flexibility and allow you to focus on exactly what you need most at that time. Finally, grab this cluster jewel socket, setting up the stage for the cluster jewels part of the build. If you're unfamiliar with these, they are a special type of jewel which expand your tree with new passives, most of which are generally stronger than other available options. Depending on how early or late you are able to get the necessary cluster jewels, you can start building this part of the tree sooner or later. The order you take passives at this stage in the game is not set in stone, so adapt to your own situation. By level 80 you should have just enough points to fill a large cluster jewel. In order of their importance, these are the passives you're looking for. Deep Cuts, which adds an insane amount of impale damage, Fuel the Fight, greatly helping with your mana sustain as well as DPS, and the third can be Martial Prowess, Smite the Weak or Heavy Hitter. These are all pretty similar in terms of added damage. As you progress towards level 90, try to get some decent medium and small cluster jewels. On the medium one, my suggestion is to look for Crywolf and Warning Call, both heavily buffing Warcries. Warcries are a special kind of buff which have stronger effects based on the number of surrounding enemies. With Crywolf passive, all Warcries will count as having 10 additional enemies. Not only does this greatly buff their base effect, but it's a crucial element against bosses that might not have adds. As for Warning Call, this reduces Warcries cooldown and buffs your crit chance and crit multiplier. For the small cluster jewel, the best option is Feast of Flesh. While it doesn't give you as much overall HP as other passives, the extra leech and, more importantly, life gain on hit makes it the top choice. Finally, back on the regular passive tree, grab Battle Cry Wheel to make your Warcries an instant cast. Instant cast in Path of Exile means you can use those abilities while moving or even while casting other skills or attacks without any interruption. You can spam Warcries mindlessly without having to time them or stop attacking. From this point onward, my suggestion is to spend whatever passive points you get past level 90 on a balanced mix of defense and offense. Steadfast and Rampart Wheels are an excellent choice, greatly boosting the effects of Fortify buff, which should be permanently present. And that's about it for the passive tree and leveling. In the next section I'll be covering the Ascendancy class, which improves pretty much every single aspect of this build. As one of the most balanced melee focused Ascendancies in the game, Champion is the perfect choice for this build. It provides equal parts of offensive and defensive tools, and it fits great with the overall approach for the build. First points go into Conqueror, a passive that is not spectacular on its own, but sets the stage for the following one. It grants a 100% chance to taunt on hit, while greatly reducing incoming damage and providing a solid chunk of life regen. After completing Cruel Labyrinth, follow up with Worthy Foe. Taunted enemies take significantly more damage and, most importantly, cannot evade your attacks. This practically translates into a 100% chance to hit without having to invest anything into accuracy. It saves a huge amount of passives and gear affixes, which can instead be used for other pure DPS modes. And by the way, you don't necessarily need to hit enemies to taunt them. Warcries will also taunt all nearby enemies, and they have quite a large area of effect as well. Third in line is Master of Metal, a passive which focuses around Impale. You get 20% increased chance to impale on hit, 2 extra impale stacks on each enemy, as well as increased physical damage for each impale stack. This passive alone accounts for over a third of your total DPS output. It's a huge damage increase and one of the main reasons for picking Champion as the Ascendancy class. Oh yeah, it also provides a decent armor buff if you've impaled an enemy recently. Finally, with your last Ascendancy points, grab Unstoppable Hero, an amazing passive with a lot of useful benefits. They all revolve around having the Fortify buff active, which is why you'll be using Fortify support in the main skill setup. So with this passive and Fortify buff up, you get a whole bunch of extra damage and attack speed, armor and evasion, and most importantly, stun immunity. In endgame, stuns are a major death cause, especially for melee builds, so having complete immunity to it will greatly boost your survivability. With the Ascendancy out of the way, we can take a quick look at the Pantheon choices. Generally speaking, Pantheon choices are situational and there isn't a best pair that will outperform all others in any scenario. However, there are certain options that complement specific builds quite well in a wide range of situations. For this particular case, here are my recommendations. For the Major God, Soul of Arakali. It offers great defensive bonuses against damage over time, and this is still one of the few remaining weaknesses for the build. On top of that, it reduces Shock's duration and effectiveness, which is one of the most dangerous ailments out there. Any additional way to shave off extra damage you receive is more than welcome. As for the Minor God, the optimal choice is Soul of Shakari. It doubles down on defense against damage over time and chaos damage. Poison immunity is also very valuable, as that's a very common type of dot encountered in higher level maps, and it usually deals a serious amount of damage. Another good alternative is Soul of Grathkul. Since you're operating in melee range and taunting everything around you, you'll receive a significant amount of hits. Reducing enemies' attack speed as well as incoming physical damage will give you some more breathing room. Having covered the Pantheon choices, we can now focus on one of the most important aspects of any build, gems and links. Before I begin, I just need to remind you that there are awakened versions for a few of the gems used in this build. Awakened gems are a stronger variant of their base, but at the same time much more expensive. Needless to say, if you can afford them or get a lucky drop, just replace the base gem with the awakened version. With that out of the way, as usual, I'll start off with the main skill, Double Strike and its supports. Ideally, you should get this gem to level 21 through corruption, as the extra level provides a significant amount of additional damage. In addition, try to get and use Val Double Strike as soon as possible. If you're unfamiliar with Val gems, they're basically a 2-in-1 kind of deal. Within the same gem you get both the regular skill as well as a Val version of it, which is sort of the same ability but on steroids. The Val part has a cooldown and also needs soul charges, which will be gathered as you kill mobs or damage bosses. In this particular case, Val Double Strike summons 2 clones of your character which attack enemies for a few seconds. They gain all the buffs and auras you had when you summoned them, so each of them deals pretty much the same damage as yourself. It's a great burst damage button that you should use against bosses or other tough targets. Then the first support gem is Ancestral Call. As mentioned earlier, Double Strike is a single target ability by default. With this support you'll strike 2 additional targets, greatly improving your clearing potential. Beyond pure damage, however, the extra targets hit through Ancestral Call will also be impaled, bleed, provide life gain on hit, leech and so on. And with more targets bleeding, the explosions caused by Hemophilia gloves have a greater chance to cause a huge chain reaction that will clear an entire screen. Up next is Impale support. I've already mentioned Impale a few times now, so this gem should be no surprise. It greatly boosts your chance to impale enemies as well as buff the effect of this mechanic. Nothing really complicated about this gem, just socket it and forget about it. First support gem is Brutality, a staple of pretty much all pure physical damage builds. You get a shitload of extra physical damage, but also prevents double strike from dealing any elemental or chaos damage. Now you might think that's a waste and additional elemental damage would still add up to more DPS. However, without scaling the odd bits and pieces of random elemental damage you might get, their value is inexistent. Everything in Path of Exile has an opportunity cost attached to it. If your swords have some added lightning damage on them, it means one of the maximum 6 affixes on that item is taken by that crappy mod. And it's crappy because nothing else in this build will improve that lightning damage. Finally, as a great side effect of Brutality gem, you're basically immune to reflected elemental damage since, you're not really dealing any with double strike. Moving on, next support gem is Multi-Strike, yet another method of boosting your area of effect capabilities as well as damage output. With it, your attacks will repeat twice, each time targeting a random nearby enemy. If you're facing a single target, such as a boss, all hits will be dealt to that target. While it's quite difficult to say exactly how much your DPS is increased when using this gem, your attacks will be significantly faster and your gameplay much smoother. Last gem in this setup is Fortify. While it's not the greatest damage support out there, it will guarantee an almost permanent uptime for the Fortify buff. This in turn significantly reduces damage you take from hits. Not only that, but we dedicate quite a few passives, including some Ascendancy points, to further buff Fortify effects or get additional damage while the buff is up. Before wrapping up this setup, I'll just add that you can replace Ancestral Call with melee physical damage when facing bosses that have no adds. Sirius is a great example of an encounter where you gain 0 benefit from Ancestral Call, so you might as well buff up your single target damage. Up next we have a few buffing and defensive skills. First is Enduring Cry, a war cry which provides endurance charges as well as a short burst of life regen. War cries are abilities which provide a buff based on the number of nearby enemies. While the gem description lists the effect for 100 enemies, it will obviously work for fewer targets as well. For example, Enduring Cry would theoretically provide 36 endurance charges for 100 nearby enemies, but that also means you'll get 3.6 charges when there are only 10 targets. Of course, you can't have 3.6 charges and this value will get rounded, but you get the idea. War cries will work for any number of targets. As mentioned earlier in the guide, a very good cluster jewel passive is Cry Wolf. With this, your war cries will always count as having 10 additional nearby enemies. As such, Enduring Cry always provides at least 3 endurance charges along with a great deal of life regen. In turn, endurance charges greatly boost your physical damage reduction and resistances. Then you have Rallying Cry, a war cry which greatly buffs your damage as well as mana regen. At this point I also need to clarify that all Warcry skills are sharing a global cooldown. However, that doesn't mean you cannot have the effect of 2 Warcries up at the same time. For example, Rallying Cry's buff lasts for about 15 seconds. You can cast it once and then spam Enduring Cry on cooldown for its life regen buff, which is much shorter. In either case, you shouldn't worry too much about perfectly timing these or having absolute permanent uptime. Do your best to spam Enduring Cry as much as you can and weave Rallying Cry in between, especially when you notice there's a very large number of nearby enemies. Moving on to next gem, Val Molten Shell will be the thing saving your life more times than you'll be able to count. This skill provides a damage absorbing shield based off your maximum armor. As the build stacks up quite a bit of that, the amount of damage Molten Shell will absorb is quite significant. Now the way I use this skill is to bind it to my left mouse button, replacing the default move. As I keep the button pressed, it will move my character as usual, but also cast Molten Shell on cooldown. Since this is an instant cast skill, it won't interrupt movement at any point. And I know all the Path of Exile experts will tell you never do that and instead cast it whenever you need it, right before you expect big incoming damage. And they would be correct. If you're good enough to always time it right and you're able to read each combat situation on the fly, or you're playing hardcore, then yeah, don't bind it to your movement slot. But the vast majority of players will get much more benefit by using this fire and forget method. Sure, you might sometimes take more damage because Molten Shell was on cooldown, but over time it will save your ass many more times than if you had always saved it for the perfect situations. Finally, the Val part of the Molten Shell is the real oh shit button. Val Molten Shell will absorb over 10,000 damage, so you should definitely keep that for bosses or very intense fights like Monoliths, Metamorphs, Simulacrum, etc. Last gem in this setup is Second Wind. It significantly lowers the cooldown of linked skills and all 3 of them can benefit from it. You can also swap this with increased duration if you want. You'll have to spam your Warcries a bit less, but you'll also get overall lower uptime for Molten Shell. Up next is your main aura setup, and the first one is Pride. This very simple aura will have enemies take more physical damage, with the effect increasing the longer they stay in its radius. Nothing really complicated. Second aura is Flesh and Stone. This is a special type of aura which has 2 different stances, Blood and Sand. You switch between them by simply casting the aura skill again. In Blood Stance it maims nearby enemy, reducing their movement speed as well as greatly increasing the physical damage they take. In Sand Stance enemies are blinded and the ones attacking you from outside the aura's area of effect will deal less damage. My recommendation is to always run this in Blood Stance unless you're dying a lot for some reason or you're playing hardcore. Next gem, Maim Support, might seem like an odd choice, but it has in fact an interesting interaction with Flesh and Stone. Its description reads, enemies maimed by supported skills take 10 to 14% increased physical damage. Well, Flesh and Stone does indeed maim enemies, so they will take even more physical damage once we add this support gem. Finally, add an Enlightened skill gem of at least level 2, but ideally 3 or 4. This lowers the mana reservation cost of the two auras, allowing you to sustain double strike attacks for longer. The numbers might not seem like much, but trust me, in practice it makes a huge difference. Moving on, we have a mobility and utility setup. Leap Slam is this build's choice for a movement skill. While something like Whirling Blades would probably be faster, Leap Slam can jump over obstacles or climb ledges, so it's the better option. You then link it to faster attacks to make it quick and more responsive. This is especially important when you use the skill defensively to dodge big boss hits or get out of nasty stuff on the ground. Blood Magic is then used for pretty much the same reason. You'll be using life instead of mana to cast Leap Slam, preventing any stupid deaths when you couldn't move because you are out of mana. The last gem, Ancestral Warchief, has nothing really to do with mobility, but it will benefit from the previous two supports, so it should be linked with them as well. This skill summons a totem which attacks nearby enemies, but more importantly, increases your melee damage while standing near it. As the totem is stuck in place, this is only meant to be used in fixed fight scenarios where you need any extra damage you can get. Next we have a simple cast when damage taken setup. This trigger gem will cast any linked active skills after you take a certain amount of damage. A higher cast when damage taken setup gem will be able to cast a higher link gem, but it would also require a lot more damage to be triggered. As such, for this particular setup, we'll keep the trigger gem at level 5. You then link it with an Assassin's Mark of level 8. Since this is a curse, you want to have it cast as often as possible, and higher level gems would not provide a huge benefit anyway. Assassin's Mark will greatly increase critical strike chance and damage against cursed enemies, as well as give you a chance to gain a power charge when killing them. These in turn will further boost your critical strike stats. The final gem in this setup doesn't even have to be linked with the other two, as it's meant to be manually cast, not triggered. Blood Rage greatly increases your attack speed and life leech, but also applies a physical damage over time debuff on yourself. However, this dot will be entirely offset by your life regen, so you don't really need to worry about it. In addition, killing an enemy while having Blood Rage up refreshes the buff's duration and has a chance to give you a frenzy charge. These charges will in turn increase your damage and attack speed even further. The final gen setup is not exactly a setup, as none of them have to actually be linked together. First is Dread Banner, an aura which further boosts your chance to impale as well as its effectiveness. It also reduces enemies' accuracy, indirectly increasing your chance to evade their attacks. While you could plant the banner in the ground to temporarily boost its effectiveness, the damage increase is marginal and you've already got too many buttons to press anyway. Then you've got Precision, yet another aura, this one increasing your crit chance. However, unlike most auras, it doesn't reserve a percentage of your total mana pool, but rather a flat amount which increases with the gem's level. As such, you can really only afford to go up to level 3 or 4, otherwise you won't have enough mana to use double strike. In my experience, having around 90 to 100 unreserved mana should be sufficient. Finally, the last gem is Summon Stone Golem. This rather resilient minion will provide a very solid life regeneration aura, which really helps with your survivability. With the gems out of the way, it's time to take a look at the recommended gear for this build. In this section, for each gear slot I will outline 3 tiers: basic, mid-tier and best in slot. Generally speaking, prices increase significantly with each tier, but so do the benefits that the items bring. Starting from the top, a good basic tier helmet has some elemental resistances, 60 plus maximum life, some dexterity, everything on an armor plus evasion base. A mid-tier one is actually quite a common unique, Star Conja's head. It provides a decent amount of life as well as some attack speed and critical strike chance, mods which aren't normally found on this gear slot. It can roll up to 70 dex, quite an important attribute if you're planning on using best in slot swords. And to top it all off, you get a really good chunk of evasion rating. All in all, a great, well-rounded item that's usually quite cheap. As for best in slot, the optimal choice is still a Star Conja's head, but with a double strike enchantment on it. Chance to deal double damage to bleeding enemies or 90% increased crit chance are both very good options. Due to its versatility, a lot of Labyrinth runners are enchanting this particular unique helmet, so you should always be able to buy one with the proper enchant at a decent price. Moving on to your weapons, these will be the absolute most important pieces of gear for boosting your DPS. You'll be using 2 one-handed swords, ideally jeweled foiled bases. The second important thing about your swords is elemental and chaos damage are both useless, since you're using brutality gem in your main setup. Just to clarify, I'm not saying don't ever use a sword that has some elemental damage on it, but those are still completely wasted affixes that could be taken up by some more useful mods. A basic sword should have over 260 physical DPS along with some critical strike multiplier or critical strike chance. Some good uniques around this tier are An's Might or Ichimonji. As mid tier, look for 300 plus physical DPS, crit multiplier and either some crit chance or attack speed. Things like chance to blind on hit or chance to cause bleeding are also useful, but don't prioritize these in any way. Best in slot swords are jeweled foils with critical strike multiplier, attack speed and critical strike chance, everything amounting to over 400-450 physical DPS. Once you start looking at weapons like these, you'll notice that almost none of them will have elemental or chaos damage mods. This is simply because, mathematically speaking, it's almost impossible to get that kind of physical DPS while wasting affixes on elemental damage. Moving on to body armor, a basic one should have at least 5 links, 70 plus total elemental resistances and 60 plus life, ideally on an armor plus evasion hybrid base. Even in the first few days of a new league, something like that should cost at most 10-15 chaos orbs. For mid tier, you should already aim for 6 links, and the best candidates are a few unique armors. The most defense oriented one is Belly of the Beast, providing large amounts of life and resistances. Another great option is Daresus Defiance, which will guarantee an almost permanent onslaught buff with greatly increased effect. Best in slow body armor is a rare, elder one with attacks have plus critical strike chance. While that crit chance bonus might seem really low, it's in fact added to your base crit, which is what gets multiplied afterwards with all those percentage increased crit chance passives and affixes. The more of those you have, the more value this affix has and the greater the DPS boost. Armors like this are generally crafted and that mod is not very easy to obtain. As such, you can't be too picky about the other affixes on the item unless you're also willing to spend quite a few exalts. In rough order of their importance, look for 80 plus maximum life, percentage increased max life, resistances, dexterity and armor evasion base. Now if you wanna go one step further, you can look for an Elder plus Warlord influence armor that has both percentage increased crit chance mod and socketed attacks have minus 15 to total mana cost. This will bring double strikes mana cost to almost nothing and allow you to replace your mana flask with the DPS one. You would also be able to further level up precision aura for even more crit chance. However, armors with both these modes and maybe another one or two useful ones will fetch a very high price, so this is really a long-term goal. With gloves, things are quite simple as there's really only one viable option, Hemophilia gloves. These will transform double strike from a single target skill with a bit of splash into a one-tap pack clearing beast. Bleeding enemies you kill explode, dealing 5% of their maximum life as physical damage is the key to making that happen. The bonus scales with all your increased physical damage sources and it can cause some very satisfying chain reactions which clear entire screens. They're always cheap and in abundance and you can use them from level 43. There's really no reason to play without these after that point. As for mid tier and best in slot, a pair of Corrupted Hemophilia with attacks have plus critical strike chance are your best bet. Similar with the affix I mentioned earlier on body armors, this bonus is added to your base crit chance, so it's a really solid DPS boost. Moving on to boots, an excellent pair of basic ones are the unique Red Blade Tramplers. Movement speed, some life, a bit of resistance and solid amount of armor. But the real selling point is the added flat physical damage, an affix that is not normally found on boots. Mid tier ones should have at least 20% movement speed, 70 plus life and 60 plus resistances. An evasion, armor or hybrid base is ideal. Finally, best in slot boots need pretty much the same affixes but with higher numeric values and ideally 40 plus dex to gather enough for jewel foil swords. Up next is your belt slot and a basic one should come with about 90 plus life, elemental resistances and perhaps some chaos resistance as well. A rustic sash base is ideal for its increased physical damage implicit. A great mid-tier belt is the unique Soul Tether, a very interesting and often confusing item. I won't go in depth here about how life leeching works in Path of Exile as that really requires a video of its own. The basic thing you need to know is that all life leech normally ends as soon as your HP is full. Even if you had a huge amount of ongoing leech, the second your life is full, all that is wasted. Well, Soul Tether will prevent that from happening and life leeching will continue even after your HP is at 100%. In practice, this translates into a lot of buffered up life leech which will go into effect as soon as your life drops again. It's a sort of standby heal over time which will greatly increase your survivability. As this is a build that relies quite a bit on leeching, I can't stress enough just how important and strong this item is. Finally, for best in slot, look for a Corrupted Soul Tether with Pride has increased aura effect or increased attack speed during any flask effect for some additional damage. The Amulet is a versatile slot in this build and it should be used to squeeze out as much damage as possible while having just enough resistances to be capped. On basic amulets, look for flat added physical damage, a good amount of life and some elemental resistances. Ideally, look for Onyx, Jade or Turquoise base so you can squeeze out some extra dex from the implicit. Mid-tier and best in slot ones have pretty much the same affixes but with higher numeric values, a crit multiplier mod and perhaps some chaos resistance or 50 plus total dexterity. If you can cap resistances somewhere else, then a critical strike chance mod will really push your DPS. Amulets can also be anointed using oils dropped from blight encounters to add a notable passive to them without changing the item in any other way. For this particular build, the best offensive option is Fatal Blade for a huge amount of extra damage. A close second and slightly cheaper one is Master of Force. However, if you feel like you're still lacking in the defense department, Cruel Preparation is likely the optimal choice in that case. With rings, it's the same story as with the amulet. Squeeze out as much DPS as possible while using just enough affixes for capping your resistances. On basic ones, look for 40 plus maximum life, just enough resistances to be capped, along with some flat physical damage. Mid-tier ones should have pretty much the same affixes, just higher numeric values as well as some critical strike chance. Finally, for best in slot, take it one step further and add some much needed chaos resistance or maybe some dexterity. While in the past chaos resistance was more of a luxury thing to have, nowadays the game throws more and more chaos damage at you, so it becomes rather important to mitigate that. Keep in mind as you can also craft hybrid elemental plus chaos resistance mods using your hideout crafting bench. You can also craft non-channeling skills have -9 to total mana cost affix on your rings to almost totally offset double strikes cost. This will allow you to further level up precision aura and reserve almost your entire mana pool. Up next are jewels, an excellent source of DPS, life and utility. They really add up, so don't ignore or downplay their importance. Even a shitty 2-mod jewel is still better than an empty socket. On regular jewels, you're looking for maximum or flat life, chance to blind on hit, flat physical damage, critical strike chance and multiplier or attack speed. The damage mods can come in a variety of formats, with swords while dual wielding, with one-handed weapon, etc. I can't list them all here, but you can find trade links in the notes tab of the Path of Building guide. Basic and mid-tier jewels can have 3 useful mods, while best in slot ones should have a 4th one, perhaps some resistance or dexterity. Finally, there are 2 unique jewels which, although really expensive, will really push your DPS to the next level. Transcendent Flesh, which needs to be socketed right above Juggernaut passive, and a Watcher's Eye with a mix of precision and Pride aura affixes. As for the cluster jewels, I've already talked about the passives you're looking for in the passive tree section, so check that out if you've skipped it. Here I'll just mention the overall structure of the cluster jewels. The large one should have maximum 8 passives, 3 significant ones, 1 jewel socket and 4 minor. The medium cluster jewels should have maximum 5 passives, 2 significant ones, 1 jewel socket and 1 or 2 minor passives. Finally, the small cluster jewel can have 2 or 3 passives, one being a mandatory significant. If the cluster jewels have more passives than what I've listed, then you'll be wasting more points than necessary. Moving on to flasks, these are quite an important component of this build and they will greatly boost your overall damage. First, you need a Seething Divine Life Flask of Staunching. Instant healing is a real lifesaver and bleeding removal is absolutely mandatory while mapping. Then, since this is a crit build, an Experimenter Diamond Flask is a must-have. Lucky crit chance means the game will roll twice to determine if a hit is a crit chance and then applies the best result. In practice, this means you get a much higher effective crit chance while the flask is active, so make sure you use it constantly. The suffix should be either warding or heat for curse or freeze immunity respectively. Third flask is a Chemist Quicksilver Flask of Adrenaline. Movement speed directly affects your efficiency and map clearing potential, and this in turn translates to a higher rate of generating currency. Fourth one is Lion's Roar Unique Flask. This grants you a huge amount of physical damage, so it fits perfectly with this build. And for the last one, I generally go with an Enduring Eternal Mana Flask. Enduring affix means the effect doesn't end when your mana is full, providing constant regeneration without needing to time your flask usage. If you have a minus mana cost body armor or brings, then you can replace this flask with a silver one for the onslaught buff. The suffix is either warding or heat, depending on what you've already picked on the diamond flask. To wrap up the gearing section, here are some excellent leveling uniques which will help you easily progress through the campaign. With the gearing out of the way, it's time to take a final look at the pros and cons of the build so you can better understand if it's what you're looking for. Starting off with the pros, a really mobile and fast-paced build, you'll never feel sluggish or slow. Excellent clearing speed, the build is very efficient at quickly killing large packs of mobs without any downtime. Easy to play without complicated mechanics or complex gearing, definitely beginner friendly. Really fun build, I know this is an often overlooked aspect in Path of Exile, but it's always great to play a build that just feels right. Efficiency scales with player skill. Getting more familiar with the build and its playstyle is rewarded with overall better performance. Each gear upgrade will be a significant buff, generally proportional with the investment. As such, it has a very high performance ceiling and the build is great for a long-term project. It will take a long time to reach a point where you feel you're no longer progressing. As for the cons, it is a melee build. This means you'll be in the thick of things most of the time, more vulnerable than a ranged character. It cannot run physical reflect maps, and there are a few other mods which cripple the build enough that you might want to reroll them. No leech and no regen are two good examples for that. You need to press quite a few buttons. While the build itself is not complicated to play or need perfect timing, you do have to use a number of buff skills and that can take a while to get used to.
Learn anything new, Exile?
If you did, then you'll probably be happy to hear there are more videos coming up in the near future with more exciting builds to try. Make sure not to miss them by subscribing to the channel so you get notified when that happens. And while you're at it, why not like this video as well or drop a comment down below to let me know your thoughts. Thank you all for watching and see you next time.